Okay, so for today's session, we're going to talk about activity-based costing. So when we talked about job order costing, so let's just kind of do a little review here. We looked at a way to calculate manufacturing overhead. Because why do we have to particularly care about overhead? Is this the one type of cost that we have that isn't directly traced to our products? There's no way for us to know exactly how many kilowatts of electricity our product used, all right, or how much rent of the factory did they really incur of the amount of space they took up. So because of this, companies collect these overhead costs together in a lump sum, and then they are responsible for taking the cost and dividing it up to the products or customers. When we talked about job costing, we talked about one method of doing it, of allocating the overhead, was to use a single PDOR, or otherwise known as the traditional method. So with this method, the entire overhead cost was allocated to each product line using a single activity base or allocation rate. So we saw examples where we took all of the overhead cost and used machine hours as the basis for dividing that cost up to our products. Okay. Another way to go about it, which is what we're going to cover today, is activity-based costing. And with activity-based costing, we're still looking at the same total amount of overhead. All right, we're still focused on the total amount of overhead we have and how do we divide it up to our product line. But now what we're going to do is we're going to break the overhead up into categories. And these categories are called usually cost pools. So here, in this problem, we have everything from machine setups to plant management, supervising of direct labor, quality inspection, expediting orders. So this total overhead that was originally $200,000 has been broken down into 5 categories. Now, for you guys, the categories will always be broken down. But in reality, what happens is management sits down and looks at this $200,000 of overhead costs, see what they consist of, and try to group them together in categories where there's a common thread. So for example, this machine setup cost pool, they could have thrown overhead costs in there that had anything to do with machine setups. So indirect labor, maintenance cost, all right, electricity, other indirect costs that would correlate with machine setups would maybe be number of oil changes, all right. So anything that, any overhead cost that had to do with machine setups, they threw it into one category. And they did the same thing with plant management. This is where probably all your plant supervisor salaries are going to be in as well. Quality inspection, this would be quality control salaries. Maybe they're looking at all the other indirect costs of the amount of space the quality control takes up at the factory, so what portion of rent would go into that group, etc. And so what the whole point behind this is, can we group the overhead cost into categories where they share a common theme, so like machine setups, where the cost is really being driven based on the use of the machine, and then say, all right, for this $16,000, what is the most appropriate way to divide this $16,000 up to our 3 product lines up here? And in this case, they said, well, we really think setup hours has a direct correlation with the cost that's in this group. And if you think about it, you know, from a intuitive standpoint, is the more setups you would have on a machine, probably the more oil changes you would use. So therefore, that drives an overhead cost. The more setups probably require the more of maintenance, hence another overhead cost. The more setup hours probably would also increase the amount of electricity for the machine. So they try to find a common correlation between the cost in this pool and what's maybe driving the cost. Now, you're never going to find a perfect correlation for every single cost in the category, but you're trying to find at least something that drives the majority of the cost. So now what we're going to end up doing, we're going to end up having various cost pools or categories of these overhead costs, and instead of having a single PDOR rate, we're going to have multiple rates. So each cost pool is going to have its own PDOR. So the instruction is asking us to use activity-based costing to calculate the unit cost of each product. So what we need to do first, and this is always step number one, is we need to first calculate the PDOR for each cost pool. And what I'm going to do is I'm given the overhead cost above, so I'm putting all of this into Excel. Once again, this step will always be given to you. You will not be responsible for having to divide up the overhead cost. So once we have our cost and our cost pool, we're going to take it and we're going to divide it by the estimated activity. Now, in some cases, your estimated activity is different than your actual activity. In this case, it's actually the same. So over here is actually our actual activity. If you're given a problem and estimated activity is not given, then you have to use actual. But the typical PDOR formula is always your estimated overhead divided by your estimated activity. But once again, if estimated activity is not given and you only are given actual activity, then you use the actual data. So I have to divide it by the total activity of the entire company. So for machine setups, I want to divide it by total setup hours. I have to sum all of the setup hours across the board for all three product lines. All right, so I need to include all three product lines in my activity. And the reason being is when we set up a PDOR, we set up one set of rates for the entire company so they can use it on all of their products. You do not have a set of rates for each individual product line. Let me repeat that. You do not have a set of rates for each individual product line. You have one set of rates for the entire company. And this is probably usually the number one mistake that gets made on exams. So now that I have my total activity in here, and I'm just double checking the math, making sure I did not type in anything incorrectly. Calculate our PDOR, and my dog seems to agree that we can go forward by taking the total overhead divided by the activity, and we get our set of PDOR rates. So that's always step one. We need the rates. So now step two, it's asking us, we want the total cost for each product. So we have three products here. And I'm not even going to try to butcher these names. I'm going to guess Dimosine. All right, there's a reason why I was not a chemistry or a science major. Homicide. Why they want to put science names in an accounting textbook is beyond me, but hey, to each their own. And when it's asking for total product, we want everything, DM, DL, overhead. All right. So let's focus on the overhead portion first. DM and DL is pretty darn easy. That information is given to us up here. But let's hit the hard one. So of this $200,000, it's going to be divided up between these three product lines. So what I'm going to do for the overhead for Dimosine, now that I have my PDOR rates, these are key. I'm going to take each PDOR rate and times it by the actual activity for Dimosine. So we have $10 for every machine setup, and they had 2 machine setups. We had $30 for every plant management worker, and they had 200 workers. We had a rate of $40 for every direct labor hour, and dime assign used 200. And we had a rate of $48 for every inspection hour, and it looks like they used 150. And then finally, we had a rate of $80 for every customer served, and it looks like dime assign ended up having 45. All right. So if I sum, I'm going to make these numbers in red and make them small. These numbers mean absolutely nothing, and that's unusual for an accountant to say, but these numbers mean absolutely nothing until they are summed up. Only once they are summed up do you have the total overhead for dime assign, which in this case is $26,800. We're given the direct material information up here of $205,000 and direct labor of $250,000. So I have a grand total cost of $481,800. But the problem was still specifically asking for the unit cost. All right. And in this case, it said the number of capsules, so with medicines, is 1 million. So we would divide by 1 million to get a unit cost of 48 cents, and God knows they probably sell that for $3 or $4, if not more, per capsule. But anyway, this is a accounting class, and usually I'm pro-capitalism, but sometimes in the pharmacy area, I feel like it might be a little too capitalist. But hey, moving along. So that's the gist of it. So the nice thing is, once you have the PDR rates down, nothing changes. So when you're doing the homicide, how much overhead we need, we're going to use the same rates, but now we're just going to times it by the activity for homicide. So $30 we have per worker, and they had 400 workers. $40 per direct labor hour, and they had 300 hours. And then we have $48 per inspection hour. They had 200 inspection hours. And then finally, $80 per customer served. And it appears that homicide served 100. Once again, these numbers mean nothing until we sum them up. And I'm just going to minimize them so you don't get stuck on those specific individual numbers. Sum them up, and the total overhead for homicide is $47,600. Let's move forward. Put in the direct material information that's given over here at the beginning of the problem. Let's make this all pretty. And let's divide it by the number of capsules. In this case, it's only 500,000 to get $1.09 of cost per capsule. All right, one more to go, Adeline. So for overhead, same thing, using the same PDOR rate, just now times it by the activity of Adeline. Looks like my hands got a little ahead of myself here. So for overhead for Adeline, we get 125,600. If I would sum up all three of these numbers, if you see down here in the total of my Excel, I have 200,000, which that should be the correct number because the original amount of overhead we were trying to divide up is 200,000. And just putting the final touches get a total cost of $646,600. Once again, we still want to know the per unit cost. Divide by the number of capsules of 300,000. And we get $2.16. Now, you may be thinking there's some information we didn't use. We didn't use anything of this budgeted cost of driver volume. We're not really getting into volume drivers. It's really just another form of a single PDOR rate. And if it's broken down into categories, so for example, if we would use direct labor hours to divide up this 200,000, then it's a single PDOR. If we use a volume driver, in this case, then it's really just another form of ADC. Particularly ADC and single PDOR, if you understand those two, you can adapt them to volume drivers because the concept is the same. You're just maybe using, instead of using supervision of direct labor or quality inspection, you're only using direct labor hours or machine hours or units produced, etc. It's just a different allocation base. So that's why I didn't do anything with this. And the number of direct labor hours, we would only use those if we were trying to assign this 200,000 using a single rate, a single PDOR, and that would be what we did of job costing, not what activity-based costing is about. So in general, the gist for ABC is you get one set of PDOR rates for the entire company. To do that, you have to make sure the activity you're using for your allocation base consists of the activity for all of the products combined. So you have to sum up the activity of all the products combined unless it's given to you as a total number. Typically, you use estimated overhead divided by estimated activity. In this problem, there was no estimated activity because actual activity was only given, so we had to use actual. The reason why you see the words estimated overhead and estimated activity is typically these PDOR rates are calculated in the beginning of the year by analysts, where they have forecasted their overhead costs and forecasted their actual activity. And then throughout the year, when we're assigning the overhead, when we're doing these calculations over here, at that point we have actual activity because the production process has begun. But like I said, sometimes estimated activity isn't given, and that's fine. If not, you just use actual activity. All right. So that wraps up this very short, brief lecture. And the attendance phrase is ABC. Can't get it any easier than that. Have a good one.